Hey everyone, it's me, Two Sheds, and today I have a new story time video for you. So before we start, I feel like I have to ask, who is the first person who comes to mind when you think of the idea of the President of the United States? I'm assuming most of you said this guy, because that's who we're talking about today. The one and only Abraham Lincoln, the man who fought the Civil War and freed the slaves, and did so while the country was more divided than it's ever been. Yes, much worse even than now. While he may or may not have been a vampire hunter, he's undoubtedly one of the most influential figures in all of history, and rightfully so. So let's talk about him for a bit, shall we?
65 years in the past, I won the Civil War with my beard. Now I'm here to whoop your...
So Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12th, 1809 in Larue County, Kentucky, to parents Thomas and Nancy Lincoln. At birth, he had one older sister, Sarah, who he was very close with through their lives. The four of them were farmers, and not particularly well-off farmers at that. Since they couldn't consistently find good land in Kentucky, the family moved to Perry County, Indiana in 1816, which was a newly admitted state at the time. While he was there, Lincoln and the rest of his family worked many odd jobs outside of the farm, such as carpentry, legal work, and county patrol. While Indiana was admitted as a free state, many Southerners would bring their slaves up north to work, and this is likely where Lincoln first learned about the idea of slavery. He and his family opposed it, which was a serious formative stance for Lincoln for most of his life, as we'll go on to see.
I ran up on your back. You cure cancer with your tears. Well, tell me, Chuck, look up and never sat down and cried.
Unfortunately for Lincoln and his family, his mother, Nancy, died on October 5th, 1818, after a battle with milk sickness. Yes, you can apparently die from drinking milk. Good thing I'm not that big a fan of it. However, Thomas Lincoln quickly got back on the dating scene and soon after married Sarah Johnston, another Kentucky native. She had children from a previous marriage, so Lincoln's family grew overnight. Abe grew very close with his stepmother over their fondness of reading. In fact, he probably learned more from her than he did from what little schooling he had. Yeah, he barely went to school at all, other than a couple of quick stints in Kentucky during those years. Once he moved to Indiana, he worked on his dad's farm for the remainder of his childhood and teen years until he eventually moved out and went out on his own path.
Right in your career, you're a washed-up has-been on TV selling total gems, and you're gonna lose this battle.
So after he moved out, Lincoln learned how to do all kinds of work in the town that he lived in. His ability to perform difficult work helped keep him afloat during the trying times in the frontier. In 1830, he entered the wrestling scene, where he gained a strong reputation and following for the first time in his life. Also that year, however, milk sickness, the disease that killed his birth mother, was having an outbreak. Due to being sort of weary of milk now, he and some of his family moved to the town of New Salem in the great state of Illinois, the state where he continued to live until his presidency. If you've never visited, yes, he's one of the prides of our state. His first job there was as a freight raft controller, where he would take some goods down the Mississippi River from Illinois to Louisiana. While he was familiar with the concept of slavery from his Indiana and Kentucky years, he first witnessed it in practice in the active slave state of Louisiana. Slavery was something he could never bear to witness. Maybe that's why he didn't keep the job for too long. In 1831, he and his friend William Barry opened a general store, which quickly turned into a tavern, and the two of them earned their bartending licenses. But that wasn't his end goal either, as we're about to see.
Like you lost Return of the Dragon. I'll rip your chest hairs out. Put him in my mouth. I'll squash you like I squash this out. I never told.
So in 1832, Lincoln entered politics for the first time in his life, when he ran for the Illinois State House of Representatives. But he dropped out when the Black Hawk War started to break out, and he entered the Illinois State Militia. He never saw combat, working as an officer rather than a foot soldier. But interestingly, another person who fought in the war was none other than future Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The irony is stunning. But anyway, after that war ended, he waited a bit longer to enter the legislature since that election had passed by the time that was over, and continued to run the tavern, now alone because his business partner was so compromised by alcoholism that he could no longer man the place effectively. However, he never lost sight of his original idea, so when the year 1834 rolled around, he made another uninterrupted run for the legislature.
Lion, I won't start now. You're a horse with a limp. I'll put my face on the side of a mountain. You voted for John McCain.
So in 1834, Lincoln moved to Springfield, the state capital of this great state of Illinois. He then joined the Whig Party and was easily elected to the state legislature. He would go on to serve from then until 1842. His biggest stance that he championed, as always, was, of course, the abolition of slavery. Much like Henry Clay, one of the most influential politicians of the time, he pushed for bringing all the freed slaves to the settlement known as Liberia, where it was believed that they would be more free and prosperous. He hated slavery before, but once his career started going, it prompted him to move higher and higher on the political ladder. Outside of this, he also pushed for a canal to be built from Illinois to Michigan, which began construction in 1836. He also gave his famous Lyceum address in 1838, which would, quite prophetically, predicted that the country was becoming more divided and could become a danger to itself if left unchecked. By the end of his fourth term, he obtained his law license and decided to step down for the time being. While on his way to that, he also made some serious advancements in his personal life.
A bucket full of my head, and I'm about to make it rain. You block bullets with your beer. I catch them with my skull.
So while on his way to actually becoming a lawyer, Abraham Lincoln had a mentor called John Stuart, whose cousin he took quite a liking to. That person's name being Mary Todd. After about a year of dating her, they engaged, and originally set to marry in early 1841, but due to various complications, it took them till November 4th, 1842. The two swiftly purchased this home, where Lincoln would proceed to live for all but the final 4 years of his life. The two of them have 4 children, Robert, Edward, Willie, and Tad. Unfortunately, all but their oldest, Robert, who actually went on to have quite a career himself, died pretty young. Despite his usual serious nature, Lincoln was a loving father who always enjoyed spending time with his kids, which is why he fell into a depression after losing 2 of them in his lifetime alone. Mary took it even worse, having to spend several years in an asylum later in life, but that's another story. Luckily for Lincoln, he always had politics to go back to distract himself from this sort of tragedy.
I make fun of Walker, Texas Ranger, but I've never even seen that. The power invested in me by the giant.
Abraham Lincoln wanted to go straight to the House of Representatives after leaving the state legislature, but ended up losing that year's seat to fellow Whig politician John Hardin. But then in 1846, Hardin dropped out of the race to fight in the Mexican-American War. He was subsequently killed in action in Saltillo. Lincoln won that spot and began representing Illinois' 7th Congressional District beginning in 1847. After arriving in Washington, D.C., he was one of the leading people in the anti-slavery wing of the party, spending his whole 2-year term trying to limit it as much as he could, even starting a coalition to abolish it in the District of Columbia and limit its spread down south. Also while there, he happened to serve alongside the aging former president, John Quincy Adams, who had been serving for years after he had left the White House. The two actually worked quite well alongside each other until his death on February 3rd, 1848. JQ wouldn't know it, but he was the first, and for the longest time only, president to die in the presence of another president. Speaking of presidents, there was a sitting president at the time that Lincoln didn't really get along with very well.
The president shall not be the shiniest of two turds! You! I wanna like you!
Lincoln joined the House on March 4th, 1847, which was exactly halfway into the term of President James Polk. Now, Polk was a Democrat and Lincoln a Whig, so the two had differing ideologies, to say the least. So you see, Polk's presidency is largely known for the Mexican-American War, which he and other Democrats got started to fulfill the country's manifest destiny. To get the war started, Polk claimed, baselessly, that Mexicans attacked the southern border and were coming into the country. Boy, how times really haven't changed. Lincoln even went so far as to question where on a map it happened. But Polk kind of dodged the question and convinced his Democratic-controlled Congress to declare war. Still, Lincoln tried to make the best of a loss. After the war ended, Whig General Zachary Taylor ran for president on his war hero status in the 1848 election. Lincoln heavily supported Taylor in hopes of a good job, but ended up not receiving it after all. So, when his term ended, he returned to Springfield to resume his legal work. For now, anyway.
Don't talk about change to do it! I thought what was on my brain until I put it went through it! And you!
Despite now being out of office, Lincoln was quickly rising to be one of the most esteemed Americans of his time. In the North, anyway. Using his power in the courtroom, he helped various railway companies expand west into America's newfound territory.
Oh shit.
His biggest success was likely Heard versus Rock Island Bridge Company in 1857, which erupted after a riverboat collided with a Rock Island Railroad Company bridge, causing various damages. While it hurt Lincoln, having previously worked on a riverboat,
You know, I'm something of a
Riverboat guy.
myself.
and even having received a patent for innovating the movements of riverboats, yes, that's real, look that up, he guided the railroad to a concise victory. He even occasionally acted as a defendant in criminal cases. Now, logic in the criminal cases of the 1850s was often questionable, but Lincoln always made sure to bring in his fair share of logic to the court system himself, even acting as the defendant in two of the most intense court cases of the day, the William Armstrong case and the Simon Harrison case. Without needlessly extending the results of these, under a lesser defendant, either of these would have ended in a guilty verdict easily, but due to Lincoln's clever use of judicial notice, and in the former case, with hearsay technicalities, he was able to get both unexpected acquittals. Due to his skills and abilities, Lincoln was once again called on by the political landscape, but this time by an all-new party.
Money man, your pancake, you flip lemonade! It's a country, not a company! You can play like Monopoly!
In 1854, the Whig Party, which Lincoln belonged to, started to fall apart. Quite a lot of them went on to form this little thing called the Republican Party. Maybe you've heard of them? Anyway, one of the main reasons why they split was because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, one of the worst laws ever approved, which basically said that the territory that is now the states of, well, Kansas and Nebraska, rather than having the government decide whether or not slavery should be legal or not, should have the people vote on it. This led to many pro- and anti-slavery people moving into that territory for no reason other than to cast a vote, which led to widespread social unrest in that area. Now, the Whig Party couldn't seem to decide their stance on slavery, and that was the push it took to collapse the whole tent. Now, some former pro-slavery Whigs just kind of sucked it up and joined the Democratic Party, but not Lincoln, of course. He and some anti-slavery former Whigs teamed up with some smaller third parties, such as the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party, to create new competition for the Democrats, the Republican Party. And it looks like they still put up a fight, don't they? But anyway, let's get back on track. By the 1856 presidential election, they had built up enough steam to run a candidate, namely former California Senator John Fremont. Lincoln proved one of his greatest advocates, but ultimately Fremont fell short of defeating former Secretary of State James Buchanan. He still did a lot better than former President Millard Fillmore, though. Man, a lot of formers in that election, huh? Lincoln was disheartened, but still had the will to go on. In fact, after the Dred Scott case and the abhorrent Supreme Court decision that dehumanized slaves even further, Lincoln felt the need to get back into office at all costs. But along the way, he faced a new challenger.
Properly reach across the aisle and bitch smack you as equals of the people, by the people, for the people.
Instead of running for the House again, this time Lincoln pursued a seat in the Senate. Lincoln faced little opposition becoming the Republican Party's candidate, being a founding member and all. However, he faced significant opposition from a sitting Democratic senator known as the Little Giant, Stephen Douglas. Now, at that time, Senate seats at the national level were not decided by a popular vote like they are now, but rather by the state legislature, which Lincoln had worked with many years ago. By now, Bleeding Kansas, as the aforementioned unrest was now being called, was having a widespread national repercussion. Lincoln reacted to this news with arguably his most famous one-liner, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Lincoln debated Douglas in front of wide audiences. This is not a common thing to happen at the time, and it drew wide attention to the two, and Lincoln rose to be a national celebrity. He fought for the rights of slaves, whereas Douglas promoted popular sovereignty, despite how well that was going. However, the legislature chose to keep Douglas for another term in the Senate. The country was as divided as it's ever been, and a collapse seemed imminent. But nevertheless, Lincoln didn't let this defeat hold him back from trying for something even better.
65 years in the past, I won the Civil War with my beard. Now I'm here to whoop your...
While slavery had been on everyone's minds since the foundation of the country, it reached the boiling point in 1860. And wouldn't you know it, that happened to be the most divisive kind of year of all. A presidential election year. Due to Lincoln's fame following the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he was the clear choice to lead the Republican Party in this election, and secured the party's nomination after only a few ballots. For vice president, Maine Senator Hannibal Hamlin, a fellow party founder, was chosen. Lincoln's main opponent from the Democrats in this election was, once again, Stephen Douglas. At least that's how things seemed on the surface. While Lincoln was popular in the North, the South hated him so much that in most states, his name wasn't even on the ballot. In fact, it was practically a completely different election down there, since Southern Democrats were alienated by Stephen Douglas as well. So they broke out and formed a new Southern Democratic Party called, well, the Southern Democratic Party. Their candidate was the very pro-slavery Vice President, John Breckinridge. Still down there, he faced competition from Tennessee Senator John Bell and the Constitutional Union Party, who is okay with keeping slavery, but did not seek to expand its reach, like Vice President Breckinridge. With the tensions at an all-time high and a clear winner far from guaranteed, all four candidates waited in suspense. But when the results were counted, Lincoln came out as the winner. He received a decisive 180 electoral votes, but due to the split between the North and South, only 39.7% of the popular vote, which, as I alluded to in a previous video, is the worst performance in the popular vote from a winning candidate in our country's history. John Breckinridge finished second, receiving 72 electoral votes and 14.4% of the popular vote. Yeah, the South wasn't too happy about that one. John Bell came in third, receiving 39 electoral votes and 12.6% of the popular vote, proving that down south, slavery was still something that most weren't willing to compromise on. Stephen Douglas came in a shockingly disappointing fourth, receiving only 12 electoral votes. But don't let that fool you, because he actually received 21.5% of the popular vote, which was more than Breckinridge and Bell's share. I've said it before and I'll say it again, the Electoral College is terrible. But regardless, Lincoln was elected to the dismay of every Southerner in the country.
Get up on your back, you cure cancer with your tears. Well, tell me, Jock, how come you never sat down and cried on your career?
Shortly after the election, the South decided they didn't need Lincoln as their president, even if he did win, despite their best efforts. On December 20th, 1860, the state of South Carolina became the first state to ever secede from the Union. Throughout early 1861, several more states followed its lead, soon forming the Confederate States of America. President James Buchanan was mixed on this development. He stated that while it was illegal for the states to secede, it was also illegal for the Union's government to stop them. Somehow. Lincoln, however, had much stronger feelings. He said that he would rather be assassinated than see one more state leave. But that's not happening yet. He clearly didn't want that either, as he traveled to Washington that February, heavily disguised due to fear of assassination plots. Despite some actually pretty close calls, he arrived safely and was inaugurated as America's 16th president on March 4th, 1861. Despite stating that he had no intention of ending slavery, nearly the entire South seceded by the time he entered the White House. It was clear that both the Union and Confederacy were only one step away from something horrible. And that step didn't take long to come.
You're a washed-up has-been on TV selling total gems, and you're gonna lose this battle like you lost return.
On April 12th, 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, an important Union military base. Lincoln hated war, but knew at this point it was the only solution. The war got out of hand very quickly, not going very well for the Union earlier on. The Battle of Bull Run, for instance, being particularly embarrassing, given how close in proximity it was to Washington, D.C. Nevertheless, Lincoln persevered, even going so far as to sign into law the Confiscation Act, which allowed Union soldiers to reclaim free slaves owned by Confederate citizens. This appealed to the anti-slavery sentiment in the North and caused the Union army size to increase by over 40,000.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part too.
Lincoln's main priority at first was to keep Washington, D.C. defended, especially after said Battle of Bull Run. But he also began making advancements into Confederate states, such as Tennessee, which the Union captured and put under control fairly quickly. But there was a bit of a setback. The commanding general of the army, Winfield Scott, retired early on in the war, and let's just say Lincoln didn't exactly make the best choice for a replacement.
The dragon, I'll rip it just crosshairs out. Put him in my mouth. I'll squash you like I squash us out. I never told a lie and I won't start now.
I bet some of you have been waiting for this part. So to replace the aging, long-standing commanding general Winfield Scott, in November of 1861, Lincoln picked popular General George McClellan. And well, let's just say McClellan proved not to be the best choice here. McClellan was known for two things: slow progress and, ultimately, failure. And worse yet, he rarely, if ever, took accountability for it, often blaming Lincoln for the decisions he made. What, did he think he could do the job any better? Wait, maybe I'm getting too far ahead of myself. Let's get back on track. After 4 months of lunacy under McClellan, Lincoln fired him as commanding general. But nevertheless, McClellan continued to disappoint, such as at the Battle of Antietam, arguably the most important battle in all of American history, which, yes, while it ended in a Union victory, was much more difficult than it needed to be due to McClellan's indecisiveness and inaction. It was, in fact, the deadliest day in the history of our country. Bro's seriously cheaty before cheaty was ever a thing. McClellan's unpopularity even rubbed off on Lincoln, as he and the Republican Party suffered serious losses during the midterm elections of 1862, and many were calling for Lincoln to just end the war already. But as it happened, Lincoln had something he wanted to say.
You're a horse with a limp, I'll put you my face on the side of a mountain. You voted for John McCain. I've got a bucket full of my head.
So remember how I said Lincoln signed the Confiscation Act back in 1861? Well, by the fall of 1862, Lincoln wanted to take things further. In addition to having signed another Confiscation Act that year to help with the war effort, he also began drafting one of his most memorable speeches, known as the Emancipation Proclamation. After finally working it out, he officially issued it on New Year's Day, 1863. The proclamation also functioned as an executive order which, at an official level, freed all the slaves in the South, though just the ones in the Confederacy. Unfortunately, the ones in the border states that stayed with the Union stayed enslaved until a certain amendment passed. On top of being freed, most slaves joined the Union military.
I'm doing my part.
I already made that joke. But in any case, this was one of the first wars in history where black soldiers fought alongside white ones, though it's worth noting that the military wouldn't be desegregated at an official level until the Truman administration. But regardless, Lincoln's action gave the Union another advantage it desperately needed.
And I'm about to make it rain. You block bullets with your beard. I catch them with my skull. I make fun of.
From July 1st to 3rd, 1863, the deadliest battle in the history of the United States was fought. A battle which I personally like to call the Big One. It all started when Confederate General Robert E. Lee sent his soldiers to the border to a little town known as Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately for him, he was met with more resistance than anticipated. After 3 days of battle and all kinds of tactics, and at least 46,000 people dead, the Confederacy was forced into a retreat. On November 19th of that year, Lincoln attended a small memorial service at Gettysburg, at which he intended to give a quick speech. After a lengthy 2-hour-long speech from former Secretary of State Edward Everett, Lincoln took the stand. He said a mere 272 words, speaking of those who died in battle for their country. Lincoln did not expect the speech to be exceptionally well received, and yet, against all odds, it went down as an all-timer for all of history. Unexpectedly so, like I said. He even said that they would little note nor long remember what was said there. That may be true for Everett, but Lincoln's words still live on to this day. I mean, look at his memorial.
Walker, Texas Ranger, but I've never even seen that. The power invested in me by the giant Bonesburg.
After the Big One, the Union pushed further into the Confederacy. General William Tecumseh Sherman, in particular, was useful with his siege of Atlanta and march to the sea. But the person that caught the eye of Lincoln the most was one Ulysses S. Grant. His lengthy Vicksburg campaign was starting to pay off by 1864, and the Confederacy was quickly falling apart. That May, Grant conducted a new phase of the war known as the Overland Campaign, in which he destroyed everything in his path, which is what he called total war. Absolutely no one from Virginia to Texas to Florida was safe from the Union at this rate. The Confederacy made one final attempt to capture Washington, D.C. that July in the Battle of Fort Stevens. This was the only battle in the war personally witnessed by Lincoln, which made it even more satisfying when the Union drove the Confederate forces back down south. Lincoln's popularity skyrocketed back to around where it was in the North in 1860, which was good for him because his first term was coming to a close soon.
President shall not be the shiniest of two turds! You! I wanna like you! Don't talk about chasing!
So during the war, Lincoln was seriously worried about his chances of being able to get reelected. Many Americans just wanted to see the war end at this point more than anything. That's why the Democratic Party, at least the members that stayed with the Union, painted itself as the party of peace and compromise. And, in fact, gained seats in the House of Representatives in the 1862 midterm elections, as mentioned before. By the summer of 1864, however, significant changes had been made, and ending the war with compromise seemed unnecessary. To bank on this, the Republican Party temporarily switched its name to the National Union Party. Still, Lincoln wanted to reach across party lines and decided to pick a loyal Democrat as vice president. Though Vice President Hamlin made an effort to convince Lincoln to stick with him for a second term, Lincoln instead chose Tennessee's military governor, Andrew Johnson. The Democratic Party, in a desperate attempt to offset Lincoln, nominated someone from out of his recent past, former commanding general George McClellan, as in the commanding general George McClellan that Lincoln fired. On November 8th, 1864, Lincoln's voters absolutely delivered. This time, he received 212 electoral votes and 55.1% of the popular vote. This is a big improvement from the 1860 election and a blowout to McClellan's 21 electoral votes and 44.9% of the popular vote. So yeah, people definitely wanted 4 more years of Lincoln. Not that that was really on the table. But let's get back on track for now, shall we? Shortly after the beginning of Lincoln's second term, Robert E. Lee, who was now the head of the Confederate military, surrendered to Grant in Petersburg, Virginia. The two met at Appomattox Courthouse, where the war came to an end on April 9th, 1865. The Confederate States were then slowly readmitted into the Union, which once again became the United States of America. Lincoln then started an era known as Reconstruction. Despite what had been happening for the last 4 years, Lincoln didn't intend to punish the Confederate citizens too harshly, likely as to promote unity after the country had finally finished tearing itself apart. That said, Lincoln did push hard for the 13th Amendment, which would go on to completely abolish slavery anywhere in the United States, North or South. South states, however, still would do anything they could to keep former slaves under their thumb and continued to for decades to follow. Lincoln signed into law the Freedmen's Bureau Bill to combat this, but the following administration didn't do well with enforcing that. What do I mean by the following administration? Well, I hate to break it to y'all, but
It's a country, not a company! You can play like Monopoly!
On April 14th, 1865, an unsuspecting Lincoln, accompanied by First Lady Mary Todd, attended a performance of Our American Cousin, performed at Ford's Theater. He sat in his own private booth, but little did he suspect that was not the only booth he would interact with that night. The other booth was famous actor John Wilkes Booth. Like a great many Confederate sympathizers, Booth was none too happy with the imminent abolition of slavery, and in a last-ditch effort, decided that killing the president who pushed for it was the best solution. Booth was familiar with Ford's Theater, having performed in many shows there, including the aforementioned Our American Cousin. That night, Booth snuck into the booth with Lincoln. After a particularly humorous line, Lincoln laughed his last laugh, and Booth fired straight into Lincoln's head. Lincoln was taken across the street and attended to by Dr. Charles Leal, but it was all in vain, as he died of his wound early the next morning. Lincoln's remains were taken to the White House as Vice President Johnson, who actually narrowly avoided assassination himself that night, was inaugurated as our 17th president. While Booth was found in Virginia and killed himself 9 days later, the damage was already done, and Lincoln's presidency came to an all too soon end, as did his life.
I'll probably reach across the aisle and bitch smack you as equals of the people, by the people, for the people.
Despite an untimely end, Lincoln's legacy lives on. He's arguably the most famous president we've ever had, and his impact is still felt over a century and a half later. Ever since the abolition of slavery, I think it's safe to say that race relations have improved quite a lot, despite a few bumps along the road. And of course, there's the fact that our great nation is still in one piece, of course. He's practically set the standard for all future presidents, even topping most polls of the greatest presidents we've ever had. Let me know if you agree with that. In any case, I'm glad you watched to the end and would like to thank you. This has been Two Sheds. Hope I see you next time.